Hello, and welcome to Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents a conversation with Radha Vatsal. Radha grew up in Mumbai, India, and came to the U.S. as a teenager on a scholarship to attend a school in Connecticut. She is a Morehead Cain Scholar at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which also happens to be my alma mater, and received a PhD at Duke University, where she studied Victorian literature and women in film history. She has experience as a film curator and a political speechwriter. She is the author of 2 books in the Kitty Weeks series about a female reporter in New York City in 1900, but we are going to be talking about the recently released Number 10 Doyers Street, featuring Ashuna Morley, another New York reporter, this time from India, who becomes entangled with city politics and a Chinatown gangster named Mock Duck. Radha, thank you so much for coming with us today.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
I had finished reading Number 10 Doyers Street, and I observe that what impresses me about the book is not only your research into New York politics at the time, Chinatown politics at the time, but your character, Ashuna, is she's a reporter for the New York Observer, and it's a kind of what I would think of as a quiet book, because she goes from place to place, observes, asks questions. She's trying to piece together some mysteries going on here regarding the future of Chinatown, the mayor, George McClellan's son, the Civil War general. There's all kinds of historical figures in here. And I don't want to say it's quiet. I want to say it's quiet in a way that it's not like I'm familiar with family sagas in which there's these great events and there's all these characters running around and sub-characters. This is her story, isn't it? This is how she's experiencing America and experiencing this particular story about Mock Duck, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and so it is Archuna's story. It is her viewpoint on Mock Duck and the world of Chinatown and gangsters in 1907 New York. But apart from the big shootout that opens the novel, this is not, Mock Duck was sort of famed for his violence. And I focused the book on a slightly different moment in his life where he was very absorbed with concerns about his family and his young daughter. And that's, I think, in part also what draws Archana to this story, that it's not just a story of gangland violence, that she sees that there's something more going on, that these are people with their lives, with their whole community. And because there were people from India in the US at the time, not very many. So there was no sort of equivalent of a Chinatown like that was with Indian people. So because Archana does not have this kind of community, I think she's also drawn to this other Asian community and to learn about how it functions. Of course, it's very, very different than her background and where she's coming from.
Mm-hmm. And we should say that it's a shooting at a Chinese opera house that takes place off the page. It actually happens before the book begins, and it becomes a moment where to kind of get set up the plot a little bit. The mayor, Georgie McClellan, wants to, as in times past, raise a section of land belonging to people who don't have the power to resist, in this case for a park.
Right, exactly. So George McClellan wants to, in response to the sort of violence in Chinatown, he decides that the way to handle this problem of immigrants and overcrowding and all this kind of thing is, let's get rid of Chinatown and turn it into a park for New York City, which at the same time is also growing. So it's been less than the story takes place in 1907, and it's been less than 10 years since the city consolidated, where New York became this big city that we know today. And so the powers that be are trying to figure out, how are we going to have parks and water and all the things we need to make the city flourish? How are we going to maintain law and order, maintain this huge influx of immigrants that are coming in? And so all of that is being sort of negotiated at that time as well.
Right. And there's also the Catskills Reservoir project that he's promoting that plays a part in this story too. But it really is a very personal story in which Arjuna is encounters Mock Duck through, what was it, the Jerry Society? Was that it? And their society to prevent the
Yeah.
abuse of children?
Yeah, so Archana comes across this whole shooting, and she sort of starts looking into Chinatown as a result of it, trying to understand what's going on there. But then she's sent to cover when the Jerry Society, which is how they call the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children, they go to Mock Duck's house, they raid his home, they take away his 6-year-old adopted daughter. And what she sees in that home is she sees evidence of a child who's been very well looked after. She doesn't understand why this child is being taken away. And then she follows Mock Duck as he fights a court case to get his daughter back. And then at the same time, he has this sort of double pressure that he's dealing with. One is that his daughter has been taken away. The other is that the city wants to get rid of his neighborhood. So those are the two sort of plot lines going through the novel, and those are the two things Mock is trying to figure out, and figure out how to sort of protect himself and protect his family from. And you say it's Archana's story, and it's very much Archana's perspective, but like a novel like The Great Gatsby, which I don't want to, I mean, obviously I'm not F. Scott Fitzgerald, but like that novel, which is really the story of Gatsby, but told from the perspective of another person, Nick. Nobody remembers the narrator so much. I think Archana is a little bit more memorable because she's so unusual, but it's really one character telling another more famous character story, or a more well-known character story. So I feel like it is actually both their stories, but it's definitely told from the perspective of Archana.
And part of what I think drives the story, at least made an impression on me, is that she's not quite sure who Mock Duck is. Is he really a gangster? Is he not? Is he like who's the other person? I'm forgetting on who's the mayor of Chinatown.
Tom Lee is
Tom,
the yes.
yeah.
His arch rival is a man called Tom Lee, who's like sort of the unofficial mayor of Chinatown. And the thing with Mock Duck, and he's a real character, was that he was very savvy. He was born in the US. He was able to understand the laws, and he was able to use them for his own advantage, to his own advantage. So he was, even though he'd been sort of accused of several crimes, he was never convicted. And he always managed to like hire excellent lawyers, or he managed to come up with great alibis. And so and he always maintained he was innocent. And so you never knew whether he, was guilty of all these things he'd been accused of. And sometimes it did go, he says in the novel, like every time anything happens in Chinatown, they blame it on me. So Archana is sort of also trying to figure out, well, can I believe this guy or not? She's seen two different sides of him. She hears how all the crimes he's been accused of, but she sees him in relationship to his child. So she's getting two sides of the same person, and she has to figure out whether he's also kind of playing games with her.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, number 10 Doyle Street, that's Mock Duck's home in Chinatown. That's why it's titled that. And what surprised me in doing research on this is at this time just how small Chinatown is, isn't it?
Yes. Chinatown was very small. So it was Doyers Street. So it was Doyers Street, Pell Street, and Mott Street, pretty much. It was concentrated around these three tiny little streets. And Doyers Street is very unusual in that it's like almost like an alley. It's got a little curve in it, very unusual for New York City streets. So the whole population there were different other pockets of Chinese Americans elsewhere in the city, but this main thing was was concentrated around these three streets, and it was a small community
Hmm.
compared
I,
to what it is now.
and I think especially if you read if your readers are you might say a fan of New York City, New York history, this is this puts you right in the middle of it. When our Ashuna is wandering the streets from one place to another, if you know you're in New York, you'll recognize them because I think you used a map to kind of trace out her path, didn't you?
Yes, I did. To me, it was very important, and it's always important to me when I write my books to like make sure that the geography works. I like to know, and to me, it makes the whole world seems more real. I like to know if a character has to go from point A to point B, how long is it going to take? How are they going to get there? What might they see on the way? And they're all in downtown New York, where she works at the newspaper, City Hall, where the mayor is, Chinatown. And then there's Foley Square outside the courthouse, where there's this guy, George Washington Plunkett, who's giving speeches on like how to be corrupt in politics. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. And I wanted to make sure that Archana, that I would have the readers see what Archana is going to see and experience as she makes her way across around town. And what I love is that it's also such a concentrated area, downtown New York, so that she can really walk most places and she really get the feel of the city, but she learns a lot by walking around too, you know?
Mm. Yeah. And that's the nature of journalism at the time, is that you have to be very hands-on and be very present in being able to engage in a lot of people. And you have her relationship with her editor as well. Not a relationship, but a contentious relationship at times, because, you know, she's one of the few women on the staff and she's getting some of these stories. And there's times when her, I wouldn't say loyalty to Mock Duck, but she gets caught up in the environment, and that puts her on contentious relationship with her editor, might be the best way to put it. So there's the journalism element in here as well, of the time, that I thought was very fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think what happens with her is that her editor doesn't know if she sort of bought Mock Duck's story, like that her editor starts to become concerned that she's just taking what he says, you know, as factual, and that she's lost her critical thinking when it comes to him. And she also has questions about that. And that was a lot of fun for me because we don't know. Even now, like, what did he do exactly? What did he don't do? The jury is out. We have no idea. So she's always wondering how much to believe him, how much not to. And her editor obviously has a problem with that. And so that was a lot of fun writing those scenes.
Yeah, and you also quote from newspapers from the time as well. And I think you were rather startled, I think, at the way Mock was characterized and
Yeah,
how the story was told.
yes, and what was so interesting to me on this story, when you read what happens, I feel it's stranger than fiction. Like I couldn't have made up what happens in terms of the little girl and what people were saying. Um, but also what was so interesting to me was that the different newspapers that covered the trial all covered it slightly differently, and they all reported slightly different facts. Which was so fascinating to me. And so then instead of, you know, forcing the reader, like telling them, oh, my version or Archana's version is the true version, I present the different newspaper accounts. And so the reader, like Archana, has to also decide, what do they want to believe? What do they not want to believe?
Yeah.
And a lot of the story, I think, is about how do we know what is true and what is not?
Yeah. And as serving as a counterpoint, as a matter of fact, was the trial of Harry Thaw for the shooting of Stanford White, which was notorious for the time. If you remember your Dr. O's Ragtime, that it opens the book and opens the movie, as a matter of fact. And you get to see how journalists or how the reporters were covering that story as opposed to the Mock Duck story, which in some cases was just not at all. And yet here they are, they want a story every day. And from my experience in journalism, that is exactly the case. If you have something big going on and it's day 4, the editor doesn't want to hear you have nothing to write about,
Well,
even if
that's
nothing happens.
Well, that's right, which is that so the Harry Thaw trial was this trial that was happening simultaneously. Harry Thaw was a millionaire and he had murdered his wife's former lover, Stanford White, and it was a big society thing. And the papers were just crazy about this story, and the public was crazy about the story. It was sort of like the O.J. Simpson trial of its time
Yeah.
and it overshadowed everything else. So it's actually quite a miracle that the mock duck story got three papers covered it. It's really amazing that they did. But even as I would go through the papers and look for information on the mock duck trial, I would see the first 3, 4, 5 pages were all about the Thought trial, every single angle. And then there was a tiny bit about mock ducks, like squeezed in on page 5. The other interesting thing about this was that Harry Thaw, who's this big Pittsburgh millionaire, and Mock Duck shared the same lawyer. Mock Duck had used Thaw's lawyer in the past, and then he uses her again once during his own case. And that really fascinated me. It showed that we think everybody is like living separate. Oh, Mock Duck is from Chinatown, so he's in his silo, and Harry Thaw's this millionaire, and he's in his silo. No, they're all connections between people all the time. And so I was just amazed that they shared the same lawyer.
Yeah. And you also have included in here George Washington Plunkett, who was a Tammany Hall politician. And I have to say, I read his book when I was studying political science at the University of North Carolina.
Oh,
So
no way.
coming across him in your fiction was just like, oh, she really does know her stuff. Because how would you expect somebody to actually stand out in public and say, yes, we're corrupt. Yes, this is graft. Graft is good.
I know he was quite amazing. And I'm not sure whether he actually stood or they just wrote this book about him standing, but I felt like he sort of captures the spirit of the times so well and
Mhm.
explained so well how the whole political system worked. And and the thing is that Mock Duck and Archana and all the characters in the novel, you're part of whatever political system is your local political system in your city, your town, whatever. And Plunkett just is like explains that to everyone sort of in a nutshell and so funnily. I felt like I couldn't not use him, but he's quite outrageous and larger than life.
Yeah. And all you had to do was quote him accurately.
Exactly. Well, that's what I found in this whole novel is that most of the time, like real life was enough.
Yeah. Yeah. As a matter of fact, you estimated in one of your interviews that like 80% of your cast are real people. Was that presenting a challenge in terms of trying to tell the story you want to tell?
No, actually, not not at all for me. I felt that they were people who had not been so fully documented that it kind of left my hands tied. They were people all who there were definitely blank spots. I had space to fictionalize. And I really they all made sense to me as people, and I feel like I couldn't have made them up. And no, I just kind of found it fascinating. But really, I think 80, 90% Archana and is one, and her husband are the two key fictional people in the novel. Nearly everyone else she meets with or comes across are real. The other newspaper reporters are fictional people, but the reports that they write are the real reports.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was all the some of these little details that you found that you put in there as well. Like she encounters tourists coming in to do the Harry Thaw tour to go to the Madison Square Garden and see where he shot Stanford White, to see the house. Um, I know Mark Twain wrote a lovely essay about lionizing murderers, but it never occurred to me that there would actually be tourists coming in on the train to spend the day in New York City looking at the sights.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole thing caused such a frenzy. It was just like that was all that everybody could talk about. And I feel like it had the same thing as like people come to New York now to do the Friends tour or whatever, some other show that's set in New
Sex
York.
in the City, yeah.
Exactly. So for them, this was like this show playing out in New York City where you could see the actual locations of what happened and kind of walk through the real spaces that these characters who happen to be real for people, moved through.
That's true. In London, you can still do the Jack the Ripper tour and
Exactly.
visit the spaces. And
Yeah.
there is a certain fascination in that, particularly in a place like London, where you can look at the same alley and it's not from the photographs that it's not really changed that much.
Yeah.
Is Chinatown today? What is it? What does it look like today? I'm not actually familiar with it.
Well, so those streets are still the same. So they're still, you can still walk. I mean, you can still walk up Doyers Street. They haven't been physically altered. It still has its curve. It's still a small little street. Pell and Mott Street are still there. Chinatown has expanded. It's much bigger than it was, but it's also being gentrified. So again, Chinatown is always under pressure for its residents to move out. So now people are just having a hard time because families that have been there for 5, 6 generations, Chinese American families are being pushed out because of raising rents and prices and things like that. So, but the geography of that neighborhood remains the same. So you can do actually a walking tour of Number 10 Doyer Street, the novel, and see all the places in the book. I think most of the places are still there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a lovely conversation Mock Duck has with Arshuna near the end of the book. Obviously, not revealing any spoilers, but it's a fascinating way of saying when he's talking about, because she's trying to find out who Mock Duck is, and he says very simply, Mock Duck doesn't exist. And she goes, "Excuse me?" He's a myth made up by those who need someone to believe in. And there's more to that, but I thought that's so fascinating. It's a division between, and I've seen this from other people. In fact, we just saw a documentary about Pierre Cardin last night, the fashion designer, and he actually says there is a Pierre Cardin who is not me. He is the brand. He is the person with a certain values, and I'm not him. I inhabit him at times, but I'm not him. And I think anybody, I guess, with any kind of notoriety has to wonder. It's on a par with saying we need Batman, even if
Right.
Batman doesn't exist. And I thought
Exactly.
that was just that was fascinating way of putting it. I thought, is that involved in some ways with, say, the immigrant experience, where you're out of a different environment, you're out of your usual environment you grow up in, and all of a sudden you're in. Um, when you came to, say, Connecticut from India, is there do you become more Indian here as a way of reclaiming your identity, or I don't know. I'm listening.
So that's a very interesting question. So to go back to Mock Duck saying he doesn't exist, I think that's just simply a matter of his notoriety, where his reputation became so big. What he was trying to tell her is this Mock Duck that you read about, that's not a real person. That's someone made up by the press, who's larger than life, who's made up by all these people in Chinatown who want to believe that there's this great kind of gang leader who can do everything. Early on in the novel, I also say, street urchins saying ditties in his honor, like people, there are all kinds of things. He can see around corners, he's like faster than bullets can't harm him. There's like all this legend of Mock Duck. So Mock is separating him from that. In terms of immigrant experience, I think some people, Mock wasn't an immigrant. As far as we know, he was born in the US. But like for me personally, I think for some people, they do become more like they become maybe more Indian or hold on more to, their traditions from back home once they come to the US. And then other people, I think, try to fit in and become more observers. And so for me, I grew up in a pretty secular, westernized family. So there were no sort of quote unquote Indian things that I needed to hold on to that I couldn't just normally do without much effort. So I feel like I spent more time. I was also like when I came to boarding school and I came to Chapel Hill, there were not that many other Indian kids around. And so I felt like I was more always trying to like understand how everybody else worked, which is what I think Archana is also trying to do. She's trying to understand how the world around her works. And I think her perspective of an outsider like lets her see certain things that other people don't see. That also probably makes her blind to certain things, but then that's the that's the way we all are, you know.
Yeah, there was a particular moment in the book when she um, reaches out to, I think, Mock's wife, I think, and gives her a Ganesh,
Yes.
a little, the Indian god, a little token. I don't want to mischaracterize it, so
Yeah,
please
yeah, yeah.
correct me. That is indicative of her culture. Do you think she is more attuned to India than you are? Is she just because she parts of her is thinking about staying in America or going back. She talks about that throughout the book, and not to say what her choice is at the end, but it is she negotiating this in the same way that you did?
I think so. I mean, in some ways, obviously I've been here a lot longer than she has. And things are different. You can go back and forth so much more easily. You can be in touch with people so much easily. Family comes back to visit. Though I was also surprised at how much people traveled back then, to be quite honest. But obviously it's
Really?
not as easy as it is now. So feel like these decisions were kind of bigger then. And she would really have been in a very, very small minority when in the early 1900s. So I think her experience would be similar and probably also different than mine, but obviously we share a lot of things in common. So
That's true. It's
can't
always
get
easier
in
to
our
write
head.
from the inside out when you're trying to do a
Yeah.
character. You had found, in fact, there were several Indian women who were actually in the United States at this time. You talked about not really believing that until you discovered that not only were they there, but one of them became a doctor as well.
Yes. And that was kind of fascinating to me. I think I've told this story a couple of times, but basically I found the mock duck story first while doing my research, and I knew I had to tell it because it was such a fascinating story. And then I thought, how am I going to tell this story of this Chinese gangster in 1907 New York? What perspective can I tell it from? I can't do it as a straight third person account without a narrator because that kind of implies like an omniscient narrator. And I really don't, I can never know enough about it. I don't speak the language. There are certain I don't know enough and I could never know enough. So I felt like it has to come from someone's perspective, an outsider's perspective. And then the question was, who would this outsider be? And I really struggled to write it. And I didn't put an Indian woman in as the narrator because I thought that was impossible. I thought that there just wouldn't be such a person there at the time. And then I was finally so frustrated after a couple of years that I said, I'm just going to pretend that such a person came to New York because New York was still a big port city, 2 million people. And then once I made this imaginative leap, I said, oh, wait a minute, maybe I should check, and this is what I find so fascinating. So we have preconceived notions about the past that literally prevent us from seeing sometimes what was there or even asking the question. So I didn't even like check whether there were Indian women or Indian immigrants who had come to the US, and it turns out that there were. And two of them, who are the most famous, came in the 19th century. One studied to be a doctor, as you mentioned. And the other, when she went back home to India, she wrote a book called Conditions of Life in the United States. And so to me, that was pretty extraordinary and, describing her understanding of America. So they kind of, both of those two women retrospectively also serve as inspirations from Archana, and then they get mentioned through the course of the book. She refers to them.
Yes, as a matter of fact, that book, Conditions of Life, that was recently published in America. I think a couple of years back they had translated it, so now
Translated. Yeah.
we could actually find out what she said about us.
Yeah.
Um, I have to ask this because it pops up in your biography. It's kind of a minor thing, but you mentioned a love of paper ephemera. What kind do you like?
I mean, I just love, I know, I love anything. I love the old little cigarette cards. You know, they used to tuck these card, like I think they were collector's cards, and they could be pictures of actors and actresses. And I have one little series called Actresses and Their Pets. And then at the back it tells you the name of the dog and what the dog was. But I love old postcards and cards, and like you can get menus and maps and all of these things. I feel like also give me such a better sense of what life was like in a different era and what people were thinking about and what they were eating and doing. And so all of these kind of throwaway things to me are so I just love them. I think they're physically beautiful. I love to read what they say.
Yeah,
Um,
I can see they would give you some idea of how they thought, how they talked, what they cared about.
yeah.
And it's really I find that sort of thing fascinating as well. There is a book called Evidence by Luc Sant, and it is a collection of unfortunately, it's early crime scene photographs.
Oh,
They
right.
from around your time period. As a matter of fact, they were doing the big tripod with the camera looking down, and they didn't know what they were doing per se, but the photography was new and they decided to try it out. And they were cleared out of the New York Police Department and they were tossed into the East River, and somehow somebody found them and brought them back up. And the thing about true crime, they freeze a moment in time.
Yes.
And as part of the evidence gathering, you're learning, what did this person do that day before the murder occurred? What do these people do? What are their days like? And it's kind of a way you get a snapshot of an ephemeral snapshot of day to day living before it happens. And that's what you're actually seeing, what tenements looked like in 1905, what the streets looked like, whether they were full of trash or whether they were clean, how were people dressed. Um, it's like ephemera, but also equally as fascinating, at least to me. Um,
Yeah. I haven't seen that book, but I should definitely look at it. It
oh
sounds
yeah, it's called Evidence, Lucsante. Apparently, he's done a number of different books as well that were like equally fascinating. But that one I have a copy of. Um, let's see. When you say you as part of your education, you'd had film studies of women in film, and you said, well, in fact, from your studies, you realize the past is not what we think it is. Is there anything in particular that brings that comment to mind, some way of how people thought or how they acted, or just,
well, so for me, I studied women in early cinema. And so one of the things that drew me to this period was this realization that, in fact, there were a lot of women working as filmmakers, not just as actresses, but in all aspects of the film industry in the early 1900s and 1910s. And, you know, they were making films, they had their own production companies, they were editing films, they were writing films. And then in the 20s, once there was more money involved in the industry, the number of women participating in women behind the camera roles went down, and it really never went back up again till the 1970s. So this whole idea, I think people have this idea of progress always being sort of linear and going upwards and without any dips. I feel like that's not true. And you can see that in women in film. You can see it for women's history. You can see it in a whole lot of other areas too. Women went to university in very large numbers at the turn of the century, and again those numbers drop. And so I feel like it challenges us to think about yeah, to think about how things happen and how progress works. You can take steps forward and then you take a step back, or actually things happen in the past that we don't even know. Like one of the other things that I was amazed to hear was that early cars used to be electric. Now
Hmm.
we're trying to electrify our cars, but we had electric cars, and then we made this decision to go to gasoline. So there are all these decisions that are being made, like things, they're choices that history has to take or the world has to take. And there are moments where it could have gone this way or it could have gone that way. Like things are not foreordained or predestined to happen a certain way. Choices are made and things happen. So I always feel like I think that looking back and realizing, oh, things could have been different or things were different makes you also think about what the possibilities for the future are in more different terms. And so also for me, realizing that like, oh, we hear about um, the sort of immigration history to New York in the 19th, early 20th century. And the people we hear about all the time are the people who came in big numbers, Irish, Italians, Jewish immigrants. We don't hear so much about the Chinese. We don't hear about the Indians who came, some came and they came via the West Coast and they settled in California. There are all these other communities who were here too. So like this is not all new. It's been happening for a long time and it's been part, I feel, of the country's fabric
Hmm.
for such a long time. And for me, that's just fascinating.
Yeah, it is. History is a lot more subtle, a lot more complex, and sometimes a lot more baffling than we know. You just have to get involved and read, and uh,
Yeah.
and books like Number 10 will contribute to that discussion as well, I think. Radha, I think we have all we need here today. I want to thank you so much for coming here and talking with us about the book. I really enjoyed it, and I really recommend it to our readers at Mechanicsburg Mystery.
Thank you so much, Bill. It was great chatting with you, and I hope people enjoy the book.
Absolutely. And for all of you at home, this is Bill Peschel for Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop, and we hope that your favorite book is the one you're reading right now. So, bye-bye. Mechanicsburg Mystery Presents is sponsored by the Mechanicsburg Mystery Bookshop in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. To learn more about the store, visit the website at www.mysterybooksonline.com. And thank you for listening.